I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt her name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from all my fears. Look to him and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. This poor soul cried and was heard by the Lord, and was saved from every trouble. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear her, and delivers them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Happy are those who take refuge in him. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord rescues them from them all. He keeps all their bones. Not one of them will be broken. Evil brings death to the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of her servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned.
This week's reading comes from Mark chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by a roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, he regained his sight and followed him on the way.
Welcome back to our Good Samaritan United Methodist Church online service. We are delighted that you have joined us, however you are finding us on any of our social media outlets, and we welcome you to this time of worship. Glad you're here. As we hear this story of Bartimaeus afresh in this season, we remember that each healing story of Jesus was very specific to each person or the group of people involved. No one healing story is alike. As you think about that and learning the stories of healing of Jesus over the years, which might be some of the first ones that come to mind? When you think about Jesus as the healer, which stories come to mind? We remember the unnamed woman who reaches out to touch Jesus' cloak. You might think of the paralytic by the pool when Jesus calls him to pick up his mat and walk. Don't think he was named in the story either. We think about another man who could not walk, and his friends went to the roof of the building where Jesus is in, and they literally tore the roof open to lower him down in order that he may be in Jesus' presence to be healed. And it was that critical role of the community assisting in healing. Another example of that would be when Lazarus comes out of the tomb and he is bound with his grave clothes. Jesus calls the whole community to unbind him in that act of healing and new life. And so many more. None of these are ever exactly the same. The same is true of our own lives, as well as our ancestors in faith. Each of you know the healing stories of your own life and of your family, of your friends, your colleagues, again, our ancestors in faith. No one healing story is exactly the same. For Bartimaeus, his recovery of sight is different than another blind man that is mentioned just a little bit earlier in the gospel, who was healed instead with Jesus spitting on his hands and putting his hands on the eyes of this other blind man. For Bartimaeus, at this point in the gospel trajectory, he is healed with Jesus' words alone. As the disciples reach out to him and tell him to take heart, Jesus is calling him forward. No two healing stories are exactly the same. So as we consider the story new and we think about the healing that we all need in our own lives, the healing of our world, of our nation, of our city, any place where we may see the need for healing, let's think about this text anew. And this time as we come around to it, I'm going to invite us to pay close attention to the cloak that Bartimaeus casts off as he goes to Jesus for healing. As we do so, a word of scholarship from Professor Luis Menendez-Antuña, who is the Assistant New Testament Professor from Boston University School of Theology. Dr. Menendez-Antuña has done some extensive research, most recently with both queer and post-colonial interpretation of biblical texts. And he brings to this look at the story of Bartimaeus a particular lens that has to do with how we respond to people with disabilities. So think about this as we interpret the text and we hear these words from Dr. Luis. He writes that the cloak here is not only an aesthetic garment. For individuals living below the poverty levels, this cloak is a piece that provides warmth in hostile weather conditions, a valuable piece that would allow them both to sleep at night or to throw in front of people to collect money. The cloak serves that dual purpose. He goes on to say that that garment is also a sign of status and power. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know how many times I've heard this story in my life, and I have never thought about the cloak itself of Bartimaeus being a symbol of status and power. It's a really interesting way to look at the text. To think of it as a symbolic garment that Bartimaeus is called to let go of all the means that he had to really literally protect himself from the elements and to be able to gain some sort of means to continue to exist because of his disability, he would have not been able to hold regular employment. He would have been shunned by the community. There's some other things going on in the text here that may first meet the eye. To let go of all the means he had to protect himself again from the elements or to pull in money from the merciful, what role does the cloak play in the story of the healing of Bartimaeus? It's a different way to think about the text. In other places in our scriptures, people are healed by touching the hem of Jesus' cloak alone. When we think about cloaks on Palm Sunday, it's of course all of the people laying their cloaks along the sides of the road to welcome Jesus into Jerusalem. And at the crucifixion, it was the division of the cloak after Jesus had been tortured that was the final act of everything that happened to him on that day. Again, the symbol of the cloak. Professor Menendez-Antuña continues, throughout the Gospels, the cloak plays different functions as a source of power, a divestment of power, of humiliation, and also of reverence. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never thought about putting all that together as we think about that imagery. It gives us a very different insight into the text, since they all share an understanding of the cloak as status. So often when we think of this piece of scripture, at least for me, I think, isn't that amazing that a blind man was healed by the words of Jesus alone? True. All that being said, lest we interpret this text as that disabilities are seen as a punishment from God, as was the case, it was seen in antiquity and is still understood in some circles today, or An inability to be healed from blindness or any other disability, an inability to be healed of that is perceived somehow as a lack of faith. I'm sure you've all heard of examples of biblical interpretations like that, which is another kind of slippery slope. What if the focus is more on the change in Bartimaeus' disposition instead? What if the focus is on his change of disposition, his change of heart? To the one who casts off the only status that he has to come and follow Jesus. So as Bartimaeus is at the side of the road and sees Jesus that day and calls out to him twice in a loud voice, what do we imagine was happening inside of him on that day? Can only begin to imagine what sort of fear or despair, isolation, exhaustion, depression, anger, any mix of all those and more. What do you imagine was happening inside of Bartimaeus as he calls out to Jesus for help? And what I believe is whatever was happening inside of him and the marginalized social status of Bartimaeus, Jesus meets him again exactly where he is at, as he asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked this question in other healing stories as well, as you know. And it's in the naming of Bartimaeus, as he names what it is that he needs, where his healing begins to happen. You know, this biblical notion of naming as a means of connecting with the divine goes all the way back to the beginning of the book of Genesis in our tradition, where it is our God that creates by speaking, as opposed to the other rival gods of the time that created by destruction. The God of our Hebrew ancestors is the one who creates by speaking. And God said there was day and there was night, etc., and God called it good. About our ancestors in faith naming the animals, about our ancestors in faith going through transitions in their lives and receiving new names of their own identity, of Abram becoming Abraham, Sarai and Sarah and Saul and Paul, all about the power of naming an internal reality that begins to become an external reality that meets what's going on inside as a person moves into a new stage in life. Bartimaeus names his need for healing before Jesus as the disciples call him forth and tell him to take heart. Friends, this is where we can all take heart on this day and every day, as we remember that we all can honestly come to Jesus with the truth of our lives. No matter how raw and complex, no matter how flawed and fabulous as those things live together in the pieces of our hearts and minds, our bodies and our souls that are all part of the great fabric of being alive. And know that in everything we will be met with God's grace, with God's compassion, and also challenged into a deeper life of faith as we cast off our cloaks that may no longer serve us, even if they were what was protecting us from the world and the ways we are living in the world, and to move from sitting beside the road to a change in our own disposition that leads to a re-energized walk of faith. You know, as I hear this story from Bartimaeus, I wonder if this is somewhat what it was like for John Wesley at the very beginning, this young, smart, very regimented Anglican priest who had dedicated his life to God, was doing his best to study the scriptures, to call other people into ministry, to study the Bible together, beginning to look at the social needs of the world and how the church was not responding. And yet at that one day at Aldersgate, as he hears Luther's commentary on the letter to the Romans, something begins to rise in his spirit that was new, where he felt his heart was strangely warmed. You all know the words from our tradition, probably. I've heard these many times, where Wesley's faith begins to move, not only engaging his mind, but his heart lived out in action in the world. a change in disposition that moves him into a new trajectory in life. And friends, the calling is the same for all of us. So whatever your need may be for healing, in the past, now, or in the future to come, know that in the naming of what we need before Jesus with the honest and raw and complicated things of our life, that we can be called into new life, and that this is all possible. And to focus not so much, again, on, for all means, considering disability to be a sin of some sort, because we know that's not certainly true. But it is this change in disposition to which all of us are called to be a part that is our walk of discipleship, that we may more fully and deeply love our God and love our neighbors and love ourselves as we respond to the world in need. Thanks be to God. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.